What's going on, everybody? It is Two Lock Sports. Happy Friday. It is Friday, January 31st. Got a nice little slate here and got some time today. Want to take some time, break the slate down for you guys, and really look at the slate based off the early view of it, kind of how I covered it in picks and pivots. Listen, it's noon. We got 7 hours until game time. The 1:30 injury report could come out and change all of this, and I'm aware of all of that. But I thought it'd be a good way to just kind of kickstart this slate. It's a real good one. We've had an awesome week of slates. We had the crazy early week slate where Giannis got ruled out, and you had Middleton and Bledsoe and Ersan, crazy chalk. And then you had a slate like last night where value never really happened. And you've kind of had that the last two nights where we really haven't had the news and value never really opened up. And as a result of that, you all of a sudden had this opportunity, I'll say, to really make different roster decisions. And it was a slate where you saw last night guys like Embiid and Beal were pretty high owned as stars, but players like Trae Young, Kawhi got completely ignored because most people ended up going more balanced because the value wasn't there. We have a totally different slate tonight. This is probably one of the more extreme stars and scrubs kind of slates that you'll see. I think that it's going to be really interesting, as we look through it, because normally, when you have a stars and scrubs slate like this, similar to what we had maybe earlier in the week with when the Bucks were chalk, you'll get a slate like this where it's so obviously stars and scrubs, but the ownership is also so concentrated. There's maybe 3 or 4 really obvious value plays, and there's 1 or 2 superstars that you feel like you just have to have. What's great about this slate is that you don't necessarily have, at least it feels like right off the bat, this crazy chalk ownership, in either way. There's not this, I think we could argue there might be 1 or 2 studs or 1 or 2 values that are the best ones. But I think there's a lot of different paths you can go. And anytime you have that, I think it sets up for a really good slate. So I wanted to walk you guys through this real quick. So what I'm going to do is, hopefully you guys can see this. All right, so what I wanted to do was start off with just the games to target tool and really more, not to jump into necessarily any of the game ratings or the pace, but just kind of get an overview of the slate, right? And you've got 7 games here, and what's really interesting, if you look at the totals, you've got 3 really high totals in Memphis, New Orleans, Dallas, and Houston, and Portland and LA, right? You've also got some decent either neutral or positive game flow environments. And when you look at all of these games, it's pretty easy to look at some of them and just cross them off. Because I think there's games in here that have very little appeal. And when we start to dig into it, I think you're going to start to see some really obvious chalk pop up on the optimizers, but I think there are ways to think through this slate differently. So what I wanted to do first and foremost, and was really, this is how I build my lineups, right? So I go into a slate. You guys know by this point, I play almost entirely on fantasy draft, but if you haven't played there and you're wondering why I talk about it, it's very similar to DraftKings. The pricing is essentially 2 times whatever you see on DraftKings, but same exact scoring and all that. It's a lot different than FanDuel. FanDuel is basically play whoever the heck you want because they're always underpriced and you can jam in everybody you want. So fantasy draft is a little bit more similar to DraftKings for you guys who haven't played it before. But what I want to do is I want to walk you guys through just kind of how I'm thinking through this slate. And I talked a little bit about this in my article today, but for you guys that maybe you're checking us out for the first time, you see this free show on YouTube, you want to see what we're about. I wanted to kind of walk you guys through this. And I also, I've got my phone here so I can check as you guys are asking questions on Twitter. I'll try to throw those in too. One of the first questions that I got was how many stars? And I think that is where this slate is going to be driven tonight. It is absolutely stars and scrubs. I would recommend that you're going to need, on a site like Fantasy Draft, at the very least 2. I think you need to make the case probably more for 3. Obviously some of this will depend on how the value pops up. But I wanted to kind of just walk you through, how I'm thinking about initial roster construction. So the very first thing that I do, and this is something that I do after I've gotten my initial research, right? And if you guys read my article today, my take on this slate is very simple. I think you've got, as I said, 2 to 3 studs. We'll talk about those in a second. But I think then you just take advantage of the value that's opened up. Right. So when I have that context going into the slate, one of the first things I do is I go into the optimizer, right? And this is just set up with nobody locked in, no rules, no nothing, right? I'll go in here. I'm going to run it just for 100 lineups. And all I want to do is just get an idea of what the general roster construction is looking like, recommended. And again, if you run these optimals, these are really set primarily for cash games, multipliers, kinds of things. Now, I know for a lot of people, you might look at this and think you're just getting a lineup. I do not look at it that way. I think this is the best way from my perspective is I'm a 1 lineup a night kind of guy. I build it by hand, but I use an optimizer. And I do this by basically building in my core and throughout the day running the projections and see what I can build around. So if you look at this slate, right off the bat, you're going to notice some things. And so I just want to talk a little bit about some of my first reactions when I open this up. First off, what you'll notice, the projected score for the optimal build sitting at 347 is insane. This is going to be a slate on a site like Fantasy Draft where normally winning GPP scores are around 350. The cash line is usually around 300. So you get $100,000 of salary cap. So you're talking about 3x multiplier to kind of think about cash games, 3.5 to think about GPPs. Tonight, throw that out the window. I think you're going to need to shoot for 350 plus just to even make money tonight. There is so many high-end stars that are just flat out underpriced, and there's crazy value almost everywhere. So, when I look at that's the very first thing that popped to me was these projected scores are super high. The last 2 days, if you ran the optimals, say right before lock, the projected scores on the optimal builds sat more like 310, 315. So you just think about, from a percentage perspective, how much of an uptick this slate is seeing in what we think the scores are going to be. So a couple things jump out. First, you got Jalen Brunson is coming out in 100 lineups. They're saying to put him in 100% of them. That's simple, right? We got Luka out tonight. And I talked about this in my article today. His previous 4 games, he's went for 30 plus in 3 of the 4. And the only one he didn't go for a 30 plus, he got 29, right? So at 7K on Fantasy Draft, you only need 21 points for him to hit value. And we've got him right now projected at 29, which would be the lowest of any of his 4 starts previously this year with Luka out. So this just feels like a very safe projection, but it's also one that's just blowing the doors off your 3.5 multiplier. The next is LeBron. And I think this is where you start to see the stars and scrubs mentality come in, right? LeBron is got an 18K price tag, which is just silly low. This is a guy that we've got him projected right now for 65 fantasy points. The matchup is just about as good as you can get. Portland has been the 3rd worst defensive team in the NBA since the start of January. And, this is something we've talked about for weeks now in our Slack about just how bad Portland's been defensively. And it's been something we've attacked time and time again, and it continues to work. When you look at his individual matchup, it's again one of the best matchups that you could possibly look for from him. And he's played them twice already. He went for 55 and 60 fantasy points in both of those games. So again, you're looking at a guy with this super, super safe floor that has just crazy upside. And I talked about this a little bit today. You guys know by now, I am like Mr. Narrative. I love it. I literally look up whose birthdays it is every day. I look to see if there's any bobbleheads or player giveaways. I do it mostly for the entertainment part of it, but sometimes it matters. And guys, this is the first game for the Lakers in LA, since the tragedy with Kobe Bryant. it is going to be an atmosphere, I just think, honestly, unlike anything we might ever see. Growing up in the New York, New Jersey area, after 9/11, I remember the game at Shea Stadium when Mike Piazza hit the home run off the Braves and the emotion, the fans just having that chance to cheer, having that chance to just forget for a little while. And to be clear, I am in no way, shape, or form comparing 9/11 and Kobe. I'm talking about how sports tends to heal after tragedy. And it's real. I think tonight you're going to see something like that, right? And you can't put projections around it. You're not playing LeBron for the narrative. Let me just be very clear. You're playing LeBron because the matchup is awesome and he's underpriced. But I do think tonight you're going to see something special from him. So I think when you kind of bring that all together, you've got a guy who's got a 55, 60-point fantasy floor, I think, in the worst case scenario. And I honestly think this is a spot where you could see 70, 80 fantasy point upside. Obviously, AD is questionable, but he's been questionable seemingly every slate. There was video of him playing soccer yesterday with LeBron before practice, so my guess is he plays. But again, I just think this is one of those spots where you just don't get cute. You're going to hear me say that a lot today. This is one of those don't get cute spots for me. As you kind of go now and you go a little bit more into this build, you're going to see this a lot today. Memphis, and Memphis. I mean, if you look at the projections, right, you've got Brandon Clark, John Morant, Crowder, and Kyle Anderson. You've got Jonas. So you've got, how many guys is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You've got 5 guys among the most projected owned. This slate, this is going to be something that you're going to see, I think, throughout the day. How many Memphis guys do you want? You get one of the fastest paces you could possibly have. It's a high total. I think it's 241, 242. Everything points to this being a great spot. You've got a little bit of a shorthanded rotation with Triple J being suspended. And I think just kind of, if you look at how the slate breaks out, these guys all feel too cheap. I talked about this today. The optimizers, when they show you this, they've got 4 Memphis guys in the optimal build on Fantasy Draft. You only can roster 8 guys. So they're telling you the optimal approach on a 7-game slate is to put 50% of your roster on one team. I don't think that you should do that. I think at some point you start to get the law of diminishing returns, right? And you're starting to cap the upside, because if Morant's going off, well, how many points are really there for those fringe guys like Kyle Anderson or Crowder, right? One of the things we talked about this morning in Slack, and we talk about this a lot, is correlations. And I want to flip over to Fantasy Labs. And if you guys have never seen this before, it is a free part of Fantasy Labs that is fantastic. If you go to NBA and you go to matchups, you can click on any team that's playing that night. And I want to go down to Memphis and just show you this, because I touched on this today, but I think it's a great tool. It's a free one that people can use, to really just make themselves better and to think about plays differently, right? It's very easy to look at an optimizer and say, okay, I'll jam in 3 and 4 Memphis guys, but is that really the right approach? So if you look at, for example, if you click on Morant and you go to correlations, this is showing you the positive and negative correlations by player, right? So what's interesting is on this slate, and with Clark likely to slide into the starting unit, you're now getting a guy in that's got significantly high positive correlation. One of our boy Tuck in Slack today was talking about this might be one of the highest correlations you'll see, and he's right. So if you look at this, Morant really works well with all of Clark, Jonas, or Brooks, right? And I think you can argue you could play any or all of them, right? You look at, if you think you want to play Brooks, what I thought was interesting here when I was looking at this is, he doesn't correlate well or as well with Clark. And one of the other things to think about too with Clark, he's only made 2 starts this year. So a lot of this correlation is coming in second team usage, second team run. So does that correlation, that range of outcomes kind of change for him now if he's running with the starters? Just something to think about as you're going through your builds. And this is something I use all the time. When you start to get slates like this where multiple players from one team are popping in projections, this is a great way to look and try and figure out, okay, so if I'm only going to pick one or two, who are the one or two that I want? So I think today, if you just look at this, and from a correlations perspective, Morant and Clark are one of the best pairings, right? And you get two guys that you can slide them into different parts of your roster with one guard and one being a forward, and it really opens up a lot. And I think that's a great way to build today. And if you go back into the optimizers, right? You're going to see. I'll refresh because we got new projections. Not a whole lot changed, right? Clark's 99%, Morant's 45%. So I think, to me, that's a great way to build. So I want to take a step back because I mentioned this today in my article. But if you take the approach that, I don't want 3 and 4 Grizzlies in. All right, well, how do I do that? So now let's start actually trying to build our lineup, right? So if we go back to the player list, this is everybody that's in there, right? And I mentioned this today. If I look at this slate, I see that LeBron is a must play. I'm not getting cute. I am locking him in at 18K. I just think you're looking at him with 65 as a projection feels maybe even low, but I think it's a good spot for him, and I think 60 to 65 is probably safe. So let's lock him in. If you look at the other stars that are on this slate, right, you've got Harden, who has just been just dreadful lately, and at 18.9, you're paying kind of peak Harden price, yet I'm not quite sure that he's the right guy that you're going to want to spend up on. Meanwhile, you've got his teammate, Russell Westbrook, who's at 19.1, and while our projections have him actually significantly lower than Harden, but you'll see here, I put in a median projection of 60. He's hit that in 5 of his last 6 games. There's just not a player right now playing at a better rate from a usage and a fantasy production perspective than Westbrook. And against Dallas, without Luka, I think that this is another spot where why are we going to get cute? You can jam Westbrook in, and it's easy. The last guy that I talked about today was Lillard. And if you think that Westbrook's been red hot, Lillard has been averaging 75, I got to remember exactly, but right at 75, 76 fantasy points over his last 4 games. The dude's just on fire, right? And if you look at his price, he's at 18K, right? None of these guys are really crazy high. The only player that is high priced is Giannis at 20.7. We're not even sure yet if we're going to play. I haven't seen anything yet from an injury perspective on him. Obviously, he missed last game. He's officially questionable. This game in general, Milwaukee and Denver's one I have not a whole lot of interest in. Denver's on the back-to-back. They flew into play tonight, and they were actually delayed due to icing, and so they didn't even get into Milwaukee until like 4:30, I think I saw some of the beat reporters saying. So, you got the back-to-back, the travel, the late, all this stuff. Milwaukee, if Giannis is healthy, they could just steamroll them. So, if you want to game stack it, sure. I just don't see this as the optimal route tonight. Paying 20.7, nearly 3K more, than getting LeBron. Outside of a GPP, because realistically, Giannis could be single digit owned, but that's really the only reason I'd go there. So, if I go back here, right, and you're talking LeBron, you're talking Westbrook, and I started talking about Lillard. He's been red hot, and I also think now you get a nice correlation between LeBron and Lillard. It's a national TV game. You've got the Kobe backdrop of all this story. You could see 2 stars just have one of those vintage performances, and you're getting 2 guys that come into the game in solid recent form, and it's not hard to fit these guys in, right? If I just look at those 3, you put them in, you'd have an average of about 9K per player for the other 5 spots, and we started looking at the value, it's everywhere. So to the question before, I think when you talk about how many studs can you jam in, I think 2 at a minimum. And really, I think you're going to see that 3 is not all that difficult to do. So that being said, one of the things that I talked about was how do I limit my Memphis exposure? I don't need, because if we were to run this, let's just do it just so I can show you guys. If we run this, you're going to see that even with the 3 studs, right, that I have, I've got 3 studs in here with LeBron, Dame and Westbrook, but it's still giving me 3 Milwaukee guys, right? Do I want that? I don't, or Memphis guys, sorry. So I don't know that I want that. So if you go back into the player list, what you can do is you go into your team stacks, click on Memphis, and you start to create rules, right? I want none, I want a max of 1, I want exactly 1, I want a minimum of 1, so on and so forth. So if I look at this and I say, you know what, all I want to do is get 2 guys, right? If you look at the last time that they played New Orleans and you look at how the game unfolded, Dillon Brooks went bonkers, scored 50 plus fantasy points. Everyone else kind of landed in the 30 fantasy point range. Between Morant, Joe Val, and Triple J. So if you assume kind of a similar thing where one guy has a ceiling game and the other guy just kind of gets you the value, especially at their prices, I think you take the approach of just doing, I'm going to take 2, right? So I'm going to take 2 Memphis guys, right, and a minimum in my lineup, right? Now I'm going to rerun it. And you start to get an idea of how things change, right? So you go back and it's, in this view, it's telling you that Clark, Crowder, and Anderson, they're using the value more than anything, right? Because this is now allowing you to jam in the 3 studs by getting guys like Brunson, right? You're getting Rondo cheap, who seemingly always has strong projections, and then using Crowder and Clark as value. If you take a step back and look one more time at this slate, I think that the one guy that is not popping in these projections and that I think he should, depending on the minutes, obviously, is going to be Kristaps Porzingis. Sorry. So if you go in here, right, and we just click on Dallas and see. So here's Porzingis, right? At 12-3, he's projected for 33 fantasy points, which is not great. The minutes have not been there lately. He hasn't been playing over 30 minutes. But now without Luka, we've seen the 4 games without Luka, it's been 50 plus every time, right? And so you've got a guy who's priced in 12.3K playing without Luka in a fast-paced spot against Houston. To me, I just think this projection is far too low. The only thing, that you're really looking at is that his projected minutes are at 28. So, it's assuming he doesn't get that minutes uptick. That's something we got to watch. It's something we got to keep in mind if we don't think, if we think that there's risk there. But again, if I'm running Westbrook, I think bringing it back with Porzingis makes a ton of sense because you're now getting the correlation where if this game goes off, right, and Westbrook is putting up a 60 fantasy point night, realistically, somebody on Dallas has to be doing it. We all know Tim Hardaway Jr. is the most likely candidate because he's the single greatest basketball player in the history of the world. But assuming he also sits because he's hurt, and believe me, if he was not questionable, he would have been mentioned today and probably in my core locks. But if he doesn't play now, the usage for KP is just ridiculous. So again, you go back here. Now let's just lock him in, right? And so we got to put all the teams back into our pool just to see now what we're showing. So again, you've got Brunson and you've got a whole lot of Memphis, right? And then it's mix and match from there. I think that the more you look at the slate and how it's playing out, I think that this is going to give you a really solid foundation from a cash game perspective. But I think it gives you crazy upside when you really think about, a GPP. So let's just assume we're going to lock in Brunson. He's 100%, he's 83% in this build anyway. So we're going to lock him in. And what I want to do is just show you guys the lineups. So if we think about this for a second, right, and we were talking about this today in Slack, and one of the things that I do is I try to carve out and chart out a bit my path to a 350 score. Tonight seems a little bit easier than it would normally be, but I think as a GPP player, it's not just as simple as clicking in the plays and saying, yeah, I like this guy and I like this guy, and if he gets there and blah, blah, blah. Do the math, right? Actually see if you think that the scenario is going to happen as you're playing out in your head, does it get you to a GPP winning score, right? So if we look at tonight, right, and I think so now I actually put in because the projections for Dame and for Westbrook were below 60, but I think based off their recent run, I think that you could be looking at more 60 fantasy point games from them, right? So if you talk about your big 3, you talk about Dame, Westbrook, and LeBron, right? You've got 180 plus fantasy points just from those three guys, right? Now, we talked about Porzingis. Porzingis is another guy who has demonstrated 50 fantasy point upside when Luka's been out of the game, right? So now you're at 230, okay? So 230, and then we look at Brunson. Brunson's projected around 30. He's done that seemingly every time he started for Luka, right? So now you're up to 260, okay? So you're up to 260 with five guys. So you've got three spots left, right, to basically get you your 100. So now from there, this is where the optimizer helps, right? Because if you're charting out that path, the way you have to think about it is, can I find three guys that are going to get me on average 33 fantasy points, right? And get me that other 100 to put me up to that 350, 360 mark. That's how you have to think about it, right? So when I walk into a slate like this and I'm using an optimizer, sure, it can run 100 lineups. It can run 300 lineups. You know, I can see if my wife wants to help and we go 150 each tonight. You know, people do that, I've heard. But on this kind of slate, I think locking in this core and then letting the day happen makes DFS a lot simpler, right? I'm not worried anymore about building a roster of 8. I'm now building a roster of 3, right? I'm done with my 5. I'm good there. I have no issue locking this in, assuming the news breaks as we expect, right? If, yesterday, if you would have looked at this, Thomas Bryant would have been popping all day. And then right before lock, he goes to the bench. The minutes become uncertain. Everybody pops, jumps off that shit. So, we're right now, everybody's on Jalen Brunson with the assumption he starts. Something crazy could happen and maybe he doesn't. Maybe that changes this. But if we assume the news is what it is, I think you walk into this slate and it breaks it down so much easier for you guys. I see this a lot in our Slack chat. We've got a ton of guys in there and it's a lot of fun having talks, but you'll see as news breaks and as the day goes on, and especially on bigger slates, it's like, we're going to throw out every name in the entire player pool. What about this guy? How about this guy? Ooh, this news just came. Now this guy's in my pool. Ooh, I got to lock him. Yeah. And it's like, stop. Because I think when that happens, that's how you talk yourself off plays that were good. If they were a good play at 7 o'clock in the morning, they're likely still a good play at 7 o'clock at night. So don't always just react. The industry does this more often in NBA than in any other sport. And, I think it's one of the things where you can really hone in on your process and change it, from that perspective. So, hopefully, that's a helpful way to think about it. So I just want to, oh no, what is going on? Clark might not play and it's Armageddon. See, this is why we don't do shows, guys. This is what happens when I try and do something, and now, let's see. So let's take a look at what news broke while I was so nicely talking to you. Brandon Clark uncertain for Friday. You got to be shitting me. All right. So that was fun. Anyway, no Brandon Clark. Good times. So of course that's going to change everything. And I'm glad you guys are popping this off in the chat. So I appreciate all of you guys dropping this in here. So there's talk about Taylor Ham in here. I mean, you guys really know how to get to me. So Mike's actually asking a legitimate question instead of talking about Taylor Ham. So I will, I'll help you with that. Kyrie versus LaVine. So you guys, I'm the perfect person to ask with this one because these two were they were in my core before when I first started today. You guys know this by now. If you follow me, if you read this, I start my research usually around 4 or 5 a.m. every day. I get up, start, diving into slates. I don't look at anything the night before. I try and come at it each day with a fresh view. My initial take was to go after Kyrie and LaVine, right? I think that is a great game. Tonight where you've got Chicago and Brooklyn playing against each other. These are two guys that right now are, with Dinwiddie back on the bench. Kyrie's usage is back up to that 35, 36% range. The volume's been there. LaVine without Markkanen, you're seeing more of the same. These are two guys that I think if the slate was a little different, if we didn't have the value, then I think I would probably have gone LeBron with LaVine and Kyrie as my core, to be honest. I probably wouldn't have gone up to Westbrook and up to Lillard. I think part of the reason why I'm going up to those guys is that we have so much value and potentially even more now with even now Clark being uncertain. It's just easy to get there. What it does mean, though, is that I think guys like LaVine and Kyrie are the forgotten stars on a slate like tonight, right? I think that they have every bit the upside. And when you look at kind of that next tier, right? Personally, I'm not on Harden. I'm not touching that until he shows me something. Giannis, way too expensive. Might not even play. While I think AD could be a good contrarian play or leverage off, the LeBron chalk, probably not going to go there either. Jokic on the back-to-back going to Milwaukee. I just, I love the big honey, but it's not going to be tonight. And then you get down into this next range, right? And it's like you get Siakam and Drummond in a really slow pace, low total game. So LaVine and Kyrie are kind of those next stars. The projections don't love them, but when you talk about ceiling plays, and you start to look at the guys who have that ceiling. I think those are guys that could put up a massive game. And you could see them at super low ownership. If forced to pick, personally, I would probably go with LaVine just because of the price. I think he offers similar upside, and you get a little bit of a cheaper price. But honestly, I think you could roll the dice, really with either of those. Please start over, Brian. Listen to me. If Brandon Clark is now out, and you're telling me that I have to play like 100% of Kyle Anderson and Jay Crowder, this slate now becomes really interesting, right? Because if that is the case, I don't know that the fringe guys are really what I want. I think I'd spend my Memphis exposure on Morant. I would go Brooks, and I'd probably go Valanciunas. I think I would just stay with those three. Let everybody chase the crazy Kyle Anderson kind of garbage. Slow-mo's going to sit in the corner, and he's going to stare at Morant and Brooks as they shoot 20 times, and that's fine. I think you could easily ignore those guys, and I think honestly that you'd be fine. So give it a second here and see if you guys have any other questions. But I am not going to no. See, this is the problem. Now this is where Dan comes in and talks about Solomon Hill. If you guys want to play chalk Solomon Hill and Kyle Anderson, more power to you. I'm not going to do that. And if that ends up being, again, this is where I go back to the optimizer, right? Now, I don't know if the projections will have updated anything for Clark. Probably not, because nothing really official has changed. So if I run 100, just to say, now Clark's still 99. So they're not going to change anything in the projections until there's an official status change. So him just now being uncertain doesn't necessarily change it. But listen, this is where you keep an eye on it, right? Because now if he is out, right, and now all of a sudden the Jay Crowders and, the Kyle Andersons of the world, and even Tyus Jones. Tyus Jones is a bench piece. He's min-priced on fantasy draft. He's hit 18 fantasy points now in 3 straight. Melton is still questionable to play, although I could look at my phone any minute and that could change. But those are the guys that are going to pop. And that's where I think you can get leverage tonight. If those become the value that everyone's jamming in, then maybe you don't go stars and scrubs, right? Maybe you go a little bit more. Maybe you drop down, like we said before, and instead of jamming in Lillard and Westbrook alongside LeBron, you drop down to guys like Kyrie and LaVine, and you live in a little bit different of a different range. So let's actually just look at that just to see what, that kind of build would look like. So if you opted to go down, with LeBron, Irving, and LaVine, you're probably going to get Brunson still, I would imagine. Yep. So you'll still get Brunson. Now, the one thing you could do here is if we want to start talking GPPs, I want 0 Memphis guys. They're gone. They're out of my player pool. I don't want to talk about them anymore. They're going to come up everywhere. So just take them out and think about the slate differently. What you're going to see, and it's not all that surprising, is the projected score of the optimals about 20 to 25 points lower than what we saw when you just ran it blind. because you're taking out all this great Memphis value. So, and if I look at this build, while there's some decent mid-range guys with Rubio and Ibaka with Gasol out, I just, to me, there's not ceiling there. And we talked about this today in the chat on this slate. If you don't have ceiling, I'm not interested in you tonight. So the Joe Harrises of the world, sure, he might get there, but you're not getting a ceiling game out of Joe Harris. And as I say that, I'm sure he'll drop 50 tonight. But those are the kind of guys when you think about your build today, if the guy doesn't have the ability to break the slate for you in a GPP, I would just move on, because scores are going to be so high tonight that I think you have to go in and kind of take that approach. Tell us about your t-shirt. No, I don't want to. It's the throwback, baby. Fantasy CPR, where we got our start. So this is it's all I got for you guys today. Hopefully this was helpful. I will, absolutely be in Slack, as all of our team will today. We'll talk through anything else that changes. I'm sure in about an hour, once the 1:30 injury report comes out, even more stuff's going to change. So hopefully this was helpful. Happy Friday, everybody. Enjoy the Super Bowl this weekend. We got some big news coming out later this afternoon in regards to the Super Bowl and some betting options for you. So stay tuned to our Twitter for that at DraftManager. Hope you guys have a great night. Let's keep killing it. And 100% THJ. Let's do it. See ya.